Hi everyone, and welcome back to Nielsen Southeast Asia, our fifth podcast, and probably one that everyone's been long awaiting, talking about the trends in China. And today I have the president of Nielsen China, Justin Sargent. Welcome to the podcast, Justin.
Thanks, Vaughan. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you, and it's exciting to talk about moving forward, I guess, from our perspective, particularly given where Southeast Asia is at, and specifically looking at FMCG and the retail market. We're obviously trying to get there, and we're excited by the prospects of it. Sometimes there's not much light at the end of the tunnel. I'm guessing that you had similar situations in China. But as we get a bit closer, we've got clients starting to ask many questions of what to and where to next. So thanks for your time. I really do appreciate it.
No problems.
One of the core things many clients are asking us is what's going on in China now that the so-called open has happened. We're really keen to see what some of the major trends are that you're seeing and any sort of highlights you'd like to call out.
Yeah, sure. So as you said, Vaughan, China is open now. The virus obviously hit towards the end of January, right in the middle of Chinese New Year, which is a huge time for China. I think there are 3 billion trips done normally over that period. So lockdown happened very quickly. And there are probably 4 or 5 weeks, I would say, of pretty severe lockdown and restrictions of movement. And then pretty much since the end of February, beginning of March, it started opening up. I would say March was generally still a bit slow. Consumers still pretty cautious. But I think the last 2 or 3 weeks in particular, we've seen a lot of business really start to come back. And, if I think about some of the macro trends, I think, there was a big phase clearly in February and probably part of March as well, all around the homebody economy, which I'm sure you'll have talked about previously, but this was when people were living at home, people were cooking. We had 85% of people in Chinese households were cooking, many of them youngsters for the first time. Obviously lots of cleaning going on. So we had categories like, antiseptic liquids growing up, 350%. We had people learning, 80% of people taking online courses and of course, digital entertainment and video, 66% of people using video. So you had this whole homebody economy. But I think probably the bigger thing, which will last into the new normal and probably drive things for the future, is the whole digital side of things. So we saw obviously massive jumps in e-commerce. So e-commerce grew by over 30% over the last 3 months. We've had O2O, or online to offline, which are really apps to allow people to order from stores or from restaurants at home. So we've seen this massive sort of growth in what we call O2O. We've seen a lot of differences in terms of how do people reach consumers, how do manufacturers reach consumers. So there's been a lot more broadcasting direct to consumers. You have these influencers or key opinion leaders in China, but we've seen lots of people themselves broadcasting. So for example, today there are 60,000 farmers in China broadcasting directly, to consumers. And then we've also seen a lot more interesting technology as well. A lot of consumers use their time at home to learn about 5G and think about, AR and VR. So I think those are 2 of the macro trends. And I think particularly the digital and technology piece is going to be something that's going to be really big for the future.
That's good. And how have retailers reacted? I guess you spoke about the O2O component, but we saw a massive surge in terms of sales, and that's in Southeast Asia across most of the markets. From earlier discussions, you suggested that this didn't occur, particularly across the Nielsen 6 stages. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think if you think about the Nielsen 6 stages, the first 3 stages about getting ready, getting prepared, and then typically there's this panic buying, pantry stocking phase. Because things happen so quickly in China, those first 3 phases really didn't happen. So you went straight into, the 4th stage and beyond. So I think some consumers clearly started stocking up on some items, some of their household cleaning items, and particularly families with young children, were buying a lot of the baby foods and infant formula. They were worried about that. But outside of those categories, there was a lot less pantry stocking. So generally speaking, consumers were calm. We didn't see the huge shifts up, in 1 or 2 weeks and then suddenly come down. We have seen some categories clearly with higher growth over this period. But generally speaking, I don't think you're going to see that roller coaster here in China that you're probably going to see in some other countries.
Okay. And in particular around online, we've seen a massive surge towards online. One of the questions that we keep asking ourselves, has online really reaped all the rewards it could have through this crisis. There's no doubt that penetration grew, and as you and I both know, penetration is a massive challenge for them at this moment. So the more users they can get is a good thing. But I'm interested to see what happened from an online and a logistics sense in China. Did you face the same issues and problems?
So again, I think the first week or two, it was a little challenging from a supply chain perspective because everyone was suddenly locked down. There was a huge surge in e-commerce, and I think a lot of the e-tailers and digital players weren't quite ready for that surge in demand. So I think there were a few logistical challenges in the first week or two. But in fairness, it got sorted out pretty quickly. There was focus, particularly on contactless delivery, and contactless payments are pretty much the norm here in China already. But I think once they sorted out that initial challenge, it was relatively smooth. And certainly there's been huge growth. A lot of the retailers, obviously did struggle during this period. A number of them couldn't get products delivered to store. Some of them didn't have e-commerce set up. So we have seen a lot of what I'd call the more traditional retailers, maybe in lower tier cities, have scrambled to set up these O2O apps. So we saw O2O grow by well over 40%, for example, during the month of February. So I think a lot of these traditional retailers have really accelerated a lot of their digital innovation. So I think that's going to be, again, something which clearly wasn't just turned on for COVID-19. That is something that will be in place for the future.
And just elaborating a little bit more on the O2O, and you mentioned a bit earlier about the 60,000 farmers connected. Is this something that since we've started to reopen, we've seen a movement definitely continue?
Yeah, I mean, O2O has been established here for a while in China, but it's probably more around the food delivery, the restaurant meals delivery. I think where we've seen here the big surges in fresh and in more groceries. So there was certainly a huge jump to start with. I think as lockdown has ended, we have seen the growth rate come off a little because I think some consumers want to get back in store. I think they want to remind themselves that life is, and I think particularly some of the the bigger stores where you can social distance, have seen a little bit of a resurgence. So I think we've seen a bit of a tick back to offline, but I think undoubtedly now that people are used to O2O, that will continue in the future. And I think one of the interesting dynamics about China is, if you think about it, over CNY, a lot of the young people went back to spend what they thought was 5 days with their parents. It actually ended up being 5 weeks.
Wow, yeah.
They used a lot of that time to teach some of the older generations what e-commerce is and what O2O is. So I think you've probably got a very different generation now, also thinking about digital in a very different way as well.
Yeah, I bet. And I guess as we spoke a bit earlier about this homebody economy, has that continued since the opening?
So some aspects, absolutely. I mean, if you think about some of the cooking categories, for example, they are still quite elevated even now. So people haven't returned to eating out as much as they used to. I think, again, the example I gave you before was older generations learning about e-commerce. A lot of younger generations have learned how to cook as well. They've actually quite enjoy it. So we do think, some of those cooking categories, those basic food categories, are going to continue to do pretty well because there's a new habit that's been formed amongst some of the younger generations. We did see some categories clearly struggle over the lockdown period. Personal care categories, people going out, impulse, gifting, etc. We're starting to see some of those categories come back now, but it is slow and cautious, I would say. Personal care is starting to rebound a bit quicker, simply because people are going out and want to pay more attention, if you like, to their appearance. But you still see some of the impulse type areas. It's going to take a little longer, I think, with some of those categories. A
bit of recovery in the personal care categories, right? After 5 or 6 weeks inside the house, if you like, plenty of food to eat, I probably need a lot of recovery.
That's right. That's right. People are washing their hair and putting on the makeup. We are seeing a bit of a resurgence in those areas.
And how have manufacturers and retailers adapted to this new economy as such?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone is still learning to a certain extent. I mean, we've done a lot of interviews with both retailers and manufacturers. So some of the big themes talking to retailers is, they're thinking about their supply chains. Clearly, they don't want to get caught out again. So they're certainly strengthening them. They're obviously opening up O2O, as I discussed. And I think we're also starting to see a bit of rethink on assortments. So this is one to watch, I think, because it's still early days, but we are starting to see retailers at least say they're going to start shifting more space to some of these these items that are more important, particularly around the health and hygiene type areas. And I think when we talked to manufacturers, we did actually a survey of 20 CEOs a couple of weeks ago. And the good news was actually most of the CEOs were pretty optimistic, despite a challenging few months. They're actually 60% of them felt that this year actually was still going to be a pretty good year. But they did talk about digital again, just learning the lessons and continuing the digital journey. They talked about cash flow. I think that's important. And the other thing they talked about was innovation, adjusting the innovation strategy. So we had 40% of CEOs saying they look to adjust the innovation strategy, and I think that'll be a challenge for brand owners. How do you innovate for the new normal? How do you build more reassurance? How do you maybe help some of the consumers overcome their fears as they want to get back out there? So I think we will see some changes, and obviously we will keep tracking this as it unfolds.
In our last podcast, Jamil spoke about the importance of innovation, and he spoke about the importance of clear labelling. I'm guessing the innovation that those C-suite were talking about was really directed around the communication as much as the product itself around that. Was that correct?
Yeah, in fairness, we probably didn't go into the details of that, but certainly the conversation that we've had, it is a lot about transparency. I think people want to know a lot more about how healthy and where it's sourced and what the supply chain looks like.
Yeah.
So there's certainly elements of that. But I think there's also, simpler innovation. So for example, during COVID-19, there were some companies that were very creative in creating family size packs of products. So the example what I talk about is milk tea type products. They're often single serve. There were great big 5-liter kegs almost being created for the in-home occasion. So, we're going to see more innovation in that area, but I think we'll also see some innovation around price points, because I think, with the uncertainty around the economy, some Chinese consumers are going to bounce straight back and probably have all this pent-up frustration and will spend big. But there'll also be some consumers that are more worried, and particularly if unemployment ticks up, maybe looking a bit more at the lower price point. So I think there'll be some innovation as well around those lower price points and maybe more widely available.
That really leads in nicely to the next question around price and promotion. What we've seen in Southeast Asia for the most part, particularly with a number of retailers, is there isn't the need to price promote. It's more about availability. Since you've gone back to the new norm, have price promotions come back?
They are coming back. Again, interestingly, when you ask the CEOs, more price promotions was very low down the list, and that's maybe because of cash flow. Having said that, stimulating demand, so now they've solved the supply issues, stimulating demand is a really important thing for them, and obviously price promotions are going to play a big part in that. There is a lot of talk here in China of new shopping festivals. The government here is talking about special shopping occasions and festivals and vouchers and coupons, which are essentially the same as promotions, just to get that stimulated economy up. And I think particularly, given the global economy will probably be looking a bit rocky for a while, domestic consumption for China is going to be really important. So even though we haven't seen a massive upsurge in promotions in the last few weeks, I think everyone's expecting that is going to play a big part in the recovery of the economy.
And a bit of an unprompted question. Across Southeast Asia most recently, we've seen a lot of local players in terms of local manufacturers really benefiting from some of the crisis. Is there been a difference between MNC and local that you've seen in China at the moment in terms of some of the behaviours?
In terms of how we've looked at the performance, there's actually not too much difference between local and MNC companies. I think some of that was, some of the big hypermarkets did reasonably well in the early stages because there were big open spaces with supply chains, and multinationals are often a bit stronger in those hypermarkets. I think this is one to watch over time though as well, because I think particularly as people look at supply chains and just figure out what's important to them, obviously local companies are eyeing up the opportunity. And certainly in China, from an imported brands perspective, with supply chains more challenged, there may be more difficulty in bringing in imported brands into China. And I think local brands may well look to take some of that space. But I think both MNCs and local companies are both facing into this challenge and trying to innovate their way out of it pretty quickly.
As we start to wrap this up a little bit, I'd be just really keen if you put your the crystal ball in front of you for a moment. Any advice you'd give to Southeast Asian manufacturers and retailers, given that you're a few weeks in advance of us, that you'd suggest that some of the more proactive ones did to actually overcome this faster than some of the others?
Yeah, I think the first thing is be confident. I mean, several weeks ago in China, things looked pretty grim, and we had no idea really how we were going to come out of it. And again, it's early days; we've got to be vigilant. But the economy is coming back from what we can see. Certainly, spending starting to come back. So I think be confident is the first thing I would say. But I think also you've got to make some choices as well. So I think consumers will have had a fairly traumatic experience. They will be looking at brands that can help them overcome their fears, and they will be looking for, innovation, particularly around convenience. I think in the near term. So I think get ahead of the curve. Think about what the new world looks like, particularly around digital, and particularly around sort of innovating, to meet different consumer needs. So I put that pretty high on the agenda for companies that are looking to come out of this. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, Vaughan, there have been big crises in the past, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the companies that lean into it and invest, even though it may be a bit painful, those are typically the ones that can really double down on their growth in the future. So I think, we'll watch that in China, but I think that would probably be some advice as well. If you can afford it, keep on investing in that brand.
No, I really appreciate your time, Justin. I know you're a busy man. It'd be great to revisit this in probably 5 or 6 weeks and see, again, given that probably at least a month in front of us where this is concerned, where China's headed. But again, really appreciate your time today.
No problems, and I'm more than happy to come and talk on these podcasts anytime you'd like me to.
I appreciate it. And just remember, everyone, that if you want to ask any questions, we'll leave all the details for you to actually contact your Nielsen contact, or you can come direct through to the Nielsen email address that we'll leave on the actual podcast details. Thanks again, Justin. Really appreciate it. And make sure everyone listens up to the next podcast, which will be out soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron.
Thanks, Justin.